Welcome back in. We are on to week 6, which means we're back for the waiver wires for this week. Thankfully, there's not anything too crazy for this week, at least yet. I mean, last week kind of broke open as the week went on. But, anyways, let's go ahead and get right to it. We're going to start with our streaming options at the quarterback position. And I will say we only have 2 teams on bye this week. So that is a positive. This week, we only have the Texans and the Vikings on bye. But let's go ahead and get to it. And we're going to start with the quarterback position. And they're going to start off with Mac Jones. Now, I want to make this perfectly clear. This is only if Brock Purdy is out, but it does sound like Purdy is going to be more of a week to week. But Mac Jones had himself a day on Thursday Night Football against the Rams. He completed 33 of 49 passes, 342 yards, and 2 touchdowns, no interceptions for 22 fantasy points. Like I mentioned, Purdy is week to week with this toe injury, and the 49ers figure to get some of their weapons back, like Ricky Pearsall and Juwan Jennings, as they take on a Bucs defense that has struggled to stop opposing quarterbacks, as they allowed the 8th most fantasy points to quarterbacks. I mean, they allowed a huge day today to Sam Darnold. And speaking of Sam Darnold, he's going to be the next guy I want to talk about here. Darnold rostered in 30% of leagues. Gets a matchup against the Jags. Now, Darnold, like I said, had himself a day, completed 28-34 for 341 yards, 4 touchdowns, and 28 fantasy points. He has now thrown 2 or more touchdowns in 3 of his last 4 games. And the Seahawks, like I said, travel to Jacksonville, take on a Jags defense that has now yielded the 13th most fantasy points to quarterbacks. So let's keep it moving here, and let's move on to Tua. Also rostered in 30% of leagues. Now, he had his best day of the season, completed 27-36 for 256 and 3 scores for another 23 fantasy points. And he's also now thrown 2 or more touchdowns in 4 straight games. I think he's becoming a little bit of a safer option and has scored 20 or more fantasy points in 2 of his last 3 games. The Dolphins will now face a Chargers defense at home that has allowed the 18th most fantasy points to quarterbacks. The next 2 are a little bit more little dicey, I would say, but Jackson Dart, roster in 39% of leagues, gets a matchup against the Eagles. Obviously, that's not great, but in his second career start, Dart completed 26 of 40 for 202 and 2 touchdowns and 2 INTs. But he also chipped in another 7 carries for 55 yards for 18 fantasy points. With his rushing upside, he will continue to have a safer floor, but will likely be capped to reach a ceiling, especially with a matchup against the Eagles, Broncos, and Eagles coming up over the next 3 weeks. This really comes down to what's sitting out there. I mean, because he's really really not a great play, I would say, over the next 3 weeks. But this rushing upside is going to allow him, I think, to be a little bit safer. Also, we have to monitor Darius Slayton, who left with an injury. I think it was around the 4th quarter as well. So really, really thinned out weapon room here for Jackson Dart. But I do expect he's going to continue to run at a very high rate. And then lastly, speaking of desperation plays, I think Bryce Young, 19% rostered. Bryce Young kind of fits that bill today against the Panthers. And they leaned heavily on Rico Dowdle. Young completed 19 of 30 for 198 yards and 2 scores. He's now thrown for under 200 yards in 4 of his 5 games. However, he does get a great matchup next week against the Cowboys defense that has allowed the most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. I think you really need the Cowboys to push the Panthers to throw the ball. And another positive could be the return of Jalen Coker, which we'll talk about when we get to the wide receivers. But the Panthers sorely missing weapons outside of Ted McMillan for Bryce Young to lean on. So I think those are probably your best streaming options for this week in terms of matchup and viability. Let's keep moving here. Let's move over to running backs. And not a ton to talk about this week, but I will say I was surprised that Michael Carter showing only rostered in 39% of Yahoo leagues and another 40% of ESPN leagues. I figured he would, but I do figure in a lot of your competitive 12-team leagues and above, he's definitely going to be rostered. But there was a ton of speculation about how the Cardinals' backfield would be split up. My lean initially was that Carter would be in the James Conner role, and DeMarcado would take the Trey Benson role, and that's exactly how we saw it play out today. Carter received 23 total touches. He played 20 more snaps than DeMarcado did. He finished with 18 carries, 51 yards, and a score, while also securing all 5 of his targets for 22 yards for 18 PPR points. And next up is a matchup against the Colts, who have been stingy against the run. I view Michael Carter as like a low-end RB2 this week, but still, Michael Carter be sitting out there, especially with Trey Benson on IR for the next 3 weeks after this. Michael Carter is a no-brainer add. I don't know why. He's only rostered in 39% of leagues. Now, the Chargers' backfield, we're gonna have to wait and see what's going on here. But Amarian Hampton was seen leaving Week 5 loss against the Commanders in a walking boot. Obviously, not great news. And at this point, the Chargers are left with Hassan Haskins and Kamani Vidal at running back. The Chargers' offensive line is also in disarray after losing Rashawn Slater at the start of the season, and then Joe Alt last week to significant injuries. And then you had Trey Pipkins and Mekhi Becton also leave with injuries. So this offensive line is absolutely ravaged. But my lean here is if Amarian Hampton misses, I think it would be Hassan Haskins would be the early down back with Kamani Vidal working in as more of a change of pace. But once Hampton left, they each received 3 carries and 1 target. We will look for a little bit more clarity, I think, in regards to this week. But I will say this is a phenomenal matchup against for any running back, really, what we're going to be targeting all year against the Dolphins, who have been absolutely dreadful against running back. We saw them just allow 200 plus rushing yards to Rico Dowdle today. So I probably wouldn't go crazy here, but Haskins probably would be my lean. Really wouldn't be shocked if Hampton is hurt if they went out and brought somebody in like Gus Edwards, but that's more of just a speculative thing off right when it comes to him. Let's keep it moving here. Let's move over to a couple of the handcuffs that I wanted to hit on. A lot of this stuff really hasn't changed all that much, but I did want to talk about Kenneth Gainwell, who's only rostered in 36% of leagues. I was actually surprised by that, especially just because of the big week that he had prior to them going on bye. But I do expect Jaylen Warren to return for this game against the Browns coming off their bye. But I think Gainwell still makes for a really intriguing option in PPR formats, as he's seen 4 more targets in 3 of the 4 games this year, and he has 10 or more touches in that same over that same span as well. So Kenneth Gainwell should be rostered well more than 36% of leagues. And then Kendre Miller is the other guy I wanted to hit on. Miller rushed for another 10 times for 41 yards, caught his lone target for 8 yards in his win against the Saints. Now, he's now received 10 or more carries in each of his last 2 weeks. He's certainly worth a stash and should continue to be in play with bye weeks and with matchups against the Patriots and Bears the next few weeks. Plus, you have the speculation of Alvin Kamara could be getting traded soon. So I think Kendre Miller is another guy I think we can easily look at. And then past that, there's your typical handcuff plus guys. I think Tajay Spears, who was back today, really didn't have much of a role. Only a couple touches in that one. I will say Rashad Smith. We'll have to see. We haven't seen Monday Night Football yet, but I think in PPR formats, again, something that you maybe could look to add if he gets more involved in his passing game, and they don't actually go out and add a running back. Isaiah Davis, I kind of feel the same about. Much more of just a handcuff at this point, but is going to mix in. We'll get some passing down work. But I will say Breece Hall had a huge day today, a really solid day today. And the rest of everybody else on here is just your typical handcuff. So let's move over to the wide receiver position. And again, not a lot to talk about. I think the best position that we're going to be talking about here is on the next one when we get to tight end. But in terms of wide receivers for this week, we're going to start with Romeo Doubs. Now, I'll be honest, he's rostered 50% of leagues. So, we'll see about, if he's in a lot of leagues, he's not going to be available. But, 50% is still 50%. So I did want to mention him here. But Doubs right now is pretty much touchdown or bust. He scored 11.8 and 29.8 in games. He scored a touchdown. The bad news is, though, he has scored 8.8 and 4.5 in games that he doesn't. He's going to be boom or bust on most weeks, especially with how much they spread the ball around. His 17% target share is not going to make him a weekly starter on most fantasy teams, but he does, I think, have some flex appeal with bye weeks going on. So Romeo Doubs, I wanted to mention him. Trey Tucker rostered 46% of leagues. I think some people probably have dropped him after kind of falling off a little bit after that huge performance that he had. Now, this wasn't the 37 burger he put up in week 3, but he was targeted 6 times today. He turned that into 4 catches, 62 yards, and their 40-6 absolute beatdown at the hands of the Colts. But Tucker is seeing enough targets to make him a usable flex option, and that is particularly true against a home matchup against the Titans this week. Let's keep moving. And I talked about this, but Jalen Coker only rostered in 8% of leagues. He was designated to return this past week. It looks like he could return just in time to face the Cowboys' horrible pass defense. Coker was drawing a ton of steam in the preseason, was looking like he was going to break out this season before suffering a quad strain before the start of the year that caused him to miss the first 4 weeks of the season. With not a lot out there, Coker is worth a stash and a desperation play against the Cowboys, who have been absolutely gashed by wide receivers this season. And Coker himself scored 21 PPR points last season against the Cowboys, hauling it 4 of 6 for 110 yards and a score. So Jalen Coker is probably, of the players that are widely available, is definitely the guy that I would look to try to add this week and stash on my bench because I think he could be somebody that breaks out here, as we go along. And then a couple other guys I want to mention. Like, listen, I get it. Troy Franklin hasn't done a ton. He's only rostered 30% of leagues, but I'm putting him here due in large part because of the role he has. Today against the Eagles, he caught 3 of 5 targets for 35 yards. Obviously, nothing special whatsoever. But the Broncos have had some really rough matchups or blowout scripts the last 3 weeks, and they're going to open things up for this passing offense with games against the Jets, the Giants, and the Cowboys coming. So Franklin looks like a usable wide receiver 4 or 5 with these upcoming matchups. Next up is going to be Torrey Horton, rostered in 6% of leagues. Rostered in 6% of leagues. All Horton does, though, is catch touchdowns. He's now scored a touchdown 3 of his last 4 games. This is certainly hard to trust, but he's worth a stash, especially if something were to happen to Cooper Kupp, who appears like he might be a little bit washed. I don't think he's the same guy he used to be, but obviously Cooper Kupp has dealt with a ton of injuries, so wouldn't shock me if at some point this year Cooper Kupp did come down with something. And I think that's where Torrey Horton, I think, best reason why I would want to stash him in teams with deeper benches. But he has flashed while the Seahawks like him so much, and he could step into a much bigger role as the season goes by. And then I want to pick Kendrick Bourne on here. Obviously, if a guy goes out and scores, has a day like he did, hauling in 10 of 11 targets for 142 yards for 24 PPR points. But this was a lot to do with Ricky Pearsall, Juwan Jennings both being out. But with the extra time off, I would expect both of those guys probably to be back next week. But I do think Kendrick Bourne is worth a speculative add because of how much these guys have been in and out of offenses or of this offense. And then obviously the familiarity with Kendrick Bourne and Mac Jones. I do think Mac Jones probably starts this week with this injury to Brock Purdy. But Kendrick Bourne, I at least wanted to put on here as somebody we should talk about. And then I think some of these other guys I think are interesting. A lot of these guys are your rookie wide receivers. I think now is a pretty good time to start stashing some of these players, like a Luther Burden, like Isaiah Bond, like Jaden Higgins, who actually had a pretty more expanded role today in this offense. I think he played more snaps than Christian Kirk did, so that is encouraging. But a lot of these guys are going to start getting more and more involved. And like the Texans are going on bye this week, I wouldn't be surprised if you start to see, somebody like Jaden Higgins take on a much bigger role within this offense. I know we saw Xavier Hutchinson today score a couple touchdowns, but I think Higgins, the second round pick. But this is a really good time to starting to target some of these guys because as bye weeks happen, this is when we start to see rookie wide receivers get more involved within their offenses. So Burden, Bond, Higgins, I think are all worth that. A.O. Manor, I still think is worth a stash. I know he hasn't really hasn't been great the last couple of weeks, but still, I think he's still worth a look. And then, other guys that are on here, I think are just purely super deep league ads. Now let's move over to what I think is probably the best position this week to talk about, and it is the tight end position. And we're going to start with Mason Taylor. The rookie tight end has now scored double-digit fantasy points in back-to-back games. Has also drawn 25 targets the last 3 games. With how poorly the Jets defense has played this year, the Jets continue to be in very heavy passing game scripts and is the clear number 2 the pass catcher behind Garrett Wilson in this offense. And Taylor is looking like a viable tight end ad with tight end 1 upside here with the Jets taking on the Broncos, Panthers, and Bengals before their Week 9 bye. So Mason Taylor is certainly worth an ad. And then Theo Johnson is another player that I think we definitely should be looking at. And I talked about both Theo Johnson and Mason Taylor in my must-start video I did this past week. Theo Johnson rewarded fantasy managers that played him with another big day, this time catching 6 of 7 targets for 33 yards and 2 touchdowns for 21 PPR points. Theo is clearly the safety blanket for Jackson Dart and is a major weapon inside the red zone. And with how poor the tight end position has played this year, Theo is definitely worth streaming in a not so great matchup against with the Eagles looming. But with him, with what we've seen so far from this offense with Jackson Dart, they are looking to get the ball out of his hands very quickly. It's going to be a lot of short intermediate targets for him, and that is exactly where Theo Johnson is operating. And then if they get inside the red zone, Theo Johnson is the main guy they're looking for. Theo Johnson only rostered 11% of leagues. I don't love the upcoming schedule. Like I said, Eagles, Broncos, and Eagles again. But still, for a tight end, that's all we're really looking for. And this is a very encouraging start for Theo Johnson. And then the other guy I really wanted to hit on is Jake Tonjes. Tonjes continues to make the most of his playing time with George Kittle's sideline. He's now scored 15 and 17 PPR points the last 2 weeks. And what was more impressive was he drew 11 targets against the Rams on Thursday night. Now, Kittle is expected to be out, probably looks like 1 more week, and then he should be ready to return in week 7. meaning that I think Taj is a very viable streaming option this week against the Bucks, who will have the 10th most fantasy points and tight ends this year. So I think those are your top three. Britton Strange is always going to be on here. Darren Waller, for most people, I think he was rostered like 60% of leagues, so he's not going to be sitting out there. But if he is, he would shoot to the top of this. Another 2 touchdown game for Darren Waller again today, but that's why he's not on here in case anybody's wondering. And then AJ Barner, I put him on here, but it's very much more for the most part this year has been touchdown upside for him. They've been looking to get him the ball in the red zone. I don't mind him either, but he's a little bit more of a deeper type streaming option. I think there might be some better options there. But let's move it on. Let's talk about a couple of these questions here, and then we'll get out of here. C. Should I trade AJ Brown and Chase Brown for Cook and Diggs? I'm assuming that's James Cook. I'm assuming. So absolutely, I would make that trade without even thinking about it. Stephon Diggs, another player that I talked about in my must-start players this week, and he was on that list. Absolutely crushed it tonight, 9 for 150. I mean, he looks phenomenal with Drake May right now, and I'm actually surprised with how good he looks coming off the injury he came off of. I mean, we have guys like Brandon Ayuk who are still out here that got hurt much earlier last year than Stephon Diggs did. And Diggs is out here balling right now, so I would definitely make that move. And then Dan, I got wide receiver depth, and I only got Gibbs, Chase Brown, and Pacheco running back. Should I trade Pickens for Scatterboo? See, what worries me about that, though, is Scatterboo, I mean, he's been fine, but, like, sounds like Tyrone Tracy could be back here soon, and with Scatterboo not really out here crushing it every week, like, I wonder what this is going to look like when Tyrone Tracy comes back. I don't think Tracy's gonna come back and, like, come back as being the lead back. I don't think that's going to happen, but, like, how much work does he lose to Tyrone Tracy, I think is gonna be the real question there, and I just don't know if I could I wouldn't wanna trade Pickens for Scatterboo, like, I think, Pickens continues to have. It wasn't a monster day today, but he had that 43-yard touchdown. But I think you could get more than Cam Scatterboo, to be honest with you. Like, you definitely could use running back help for sure, but I think you could get more for Pickens than Scatterboo. I think it's the way that I would look at it. X Factor thoughts on Kendra Miller. Kind of talked about that already. If you want to go back to the running back section, but I will just talk about it again. I think you saw him today. Another 10 carries for him, 41 yards, and I think he's really a really solid stash within this offense because they're going to continue to give him work. They're going to continue to give him early down work. It doesn't look like he's really going to be involved in the passing game with Alvin Kamara being there. But I will say that there's been all this speculation that Kamara can be traded, and I think there's a lot of smoke around a lot of players all the time as the season goes by. Every single year, not a lot happens with it. But I think there's a real scenario here that they move on from Kamara. Like, they're not going anywhere this year. And, Kamara is entering the twilight of his career. I would assume that he wants at least some shot of winning a Super Bowl or going to the playoffs. And, does have another year after this year, but it's very manageable. So I would be surprised if they didn't trade Alvin Kamara. So that's why I think Kendre Miller is actually a pretty smart stash if you can, because if that were to happen, then Kendre Miller just goes straight into the lead back role there in that offense. PPR ranked rest of season: Mason Taylor, Theo Johnson, Harold Fannin, AJ Barner, or Taysom Hill. Taysom Hill came back play today, didn't really do a whole lot. I think he had 6 carries, like -2 yards. Wasn't utilized much out of that. Like, the thing with him, and I know we all look at we all look at Taysom Hill and what he's been able to do, and he's been phenomenal. And it's awesome that he's already back right now. But I just have no clue how he's getting utilized in this offense right now. So he probably would be last. Or actually, I probably would have Barner last, just because I don't know if we could probably trust it with just the limited touchdown work that he gets. And then you also have the other rookie tight end as well that's probably going to mix in. So I would probably do this, and just looking at this in terms of situation and everything right now, I probably would do Mason Taylor and then Theo Johnson, and those two are pretty close. Harold Fannin's not far behind, but he has to deal with David Njoku, and we really would need a trade of David Njoku, I think, for him to really catapult. Because if that were to happen, he would move to number 1 for me, I think. I love Harold Fannin Jr., but there's just still a lot of players there. Jerry Jeudy, David Njoku's still there, and you're dealing with a rookie quarterback and Dylan Gabriel, who actually didn't look too bad today, actually, for his start. And then, then past that, I would put it at Taysom Hill, then AJ Barner, I think, is the way I would look at it. I think Hill probably has maybe the highest ceiling just because of we've seen the role that he gets played in. But I just don't know if that's going to be the type of role he's going to get here. So I think he's a much more volatile play. But I definitely love these rookie. Well, I should say the two rookie tight ends and Theo Johnson, who's his second year tight end here. I think all of those guys are definitely worth a look. Thank you. My bad. I have Javonte Williams, Chase Brown, Rico, Woody, Rashad Smith, more of another stash of anything waiting. Appreciate it. Yeah, for sure. And, honestly, like Rico Dowdle might be a really strong, look to try to sell high, see what you can get for Rico Dowdle, especially if you don't have Chuba Hubbard, because I mean that was a monster game from him today, and the Chuba Hubbard owner might be looking at wanting to see what you could get for that. So he's not worth, or he's a pretty solid, I think, sell high if you can coming off a game like that. But yeah, I like a lot. Javonte Williams right now through 5 weeks of the season, I think looks like one of the best just late round picks that we've seen. Kind of like I don't even know if I would call it similar because Chase Brown ended up having to, overtake Zach Moss. Like with Javonte Williams, it looks like a home run right now. He is absolutely crushing, playing all of the snaps, and just looks like the dude, looks like the guy that we were kind of hoping he would be. So Javonte Williams has been phenomenal. Definitely deserves a lot of credit. But yeah, I think that's something you could look to do. But love this running back room you got going here. So that being said, I'm going to go ahead and get out of here so I don't waste everybody's time. It's already late. Just it took me a little bit later to get going tonight. I had some stuff going on today. But that being said, appreciate everybody rocking with us. We'll be back in tomorrow, or I'll be recording tomorrow night. And Tuesday morning, you'll be look for the defenses kicker video. And then we're going to run it back for another week with my all-encompassing quarterback, running back, wide receiver, and tight end must plays of the week. That I feel like did actually really well this week with, like I already mentioned, Mason Taylor and Theo Johnson. Stephon Diggs was on there. There's a bunch of other guys that were on there. I think that really worked out. So we're going to do it again next week. So let's keep it locked in here, and we'll see you on the next one. Everybody have a great night, and we will see you guys tomorrow. Bye.